Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our session. Today, we're going to talk about our all-new V6 Web SDK and how you can create modern and flexible integrations with it. I'm Andrew Little. I'm a product manager here on the V6 team, and I've been here at PayPal for about a year and a half.
I'm Greg Jopa. I am a lead engineer on the V6 SDK team based out of Chicago.
So just doing a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Greg's going to walk through how would you build a brand new web SDK in 2025. Then we're going to talk about how flexibility and performance guided us through our architecture and development decisions. And then finally, we're going to make sure that you have the resources to start integrating with our SDK today.
All right. I want to start it off with some questions. So raise your hand if you've ever used a web SDK, any web SDK. All right. Well, shout out the SDK you've used. What have you used? A bunch? PayPal? It can't be PayPal. Come on, other ones. Braintree. Anything? How about something that's not payments? Twilio, sending, doing phone calls and texts. Google Maps. These are all examples of web SDKs that you would add to your website for specific functionality. Who here has used the PayPal V5 SDK? All right. I saw a lot of hands. That SDK was actually built back in 2017. So the question on the screen here, let's break it down a bit. How would you build a web SDK in 2025? So PayPal's web SDK, here are the requirements we're working with. We need to provide merchants with a single JavaScript file that's able to load any of PayPal's products for merchants' e-commerce websites. Products like the payment buttons, the card forms, credit messaging for offers like Pay in 4. We need an SDK that's able to do all of those products. And merchants typically only use a handful of those products. They could use them all, but they might not be. So we need this SDK to be performant and aware of what products they want and only load the code required for that. So the last part of this question is talking about 2025. So before we get to that part, let's go back in time to 2017. This is when we released the V5 SDK at PayPal. And at that time, it was cutting edge. It was fast, it was exciting. But the requirements in 2017 were, number one, we needed to support Internet Explorer 11. Has anyone built a JavaScript code or website that needed to run in IE 11? Raise your hand. Yeah, so a few sad people. IE 11 did not even support native JavaScript promises. So that meant our SDK could not rely on native promises. We had to polyfill that. So we were working with legacy browsers under those constraints back in 2017. Another thing is in 2017, the main way to make sure your CSS code as a third-party JavaScript SDK that did UI components, to make sure that CSS code didn't impact the merchant's website was to wrap your UI components in an iframe. Iframes are complex, and we did a lot of stuff in V5 to try to make iframes as fast as possible. But those were the constraints we were working with back in 2017. All right, so back to the question on the screen. How would you build a web SDK in 2025? Web components. You looked ahead. Our answer to that question is to embrace the modern web. So as my friend here just called out, let's use web components instead of iframes. For our payment buttons or our credit messages, there's no reason those components need to be in an iframe. They're not dealing with any sensitive data. So now we can actually render those in a web component. Web components are a native thing built into the browsers. They are standardized. They also offer a feature called Shadow DOM. So inside the web component, you can leverage Shadow DOM to isolate your CSS, make sure your styles don't bleed out into the merchant page and accidentally style something on their page. We still use iframes for card forms. We still like iframes, but we're only using them when necessary. The other awesome thing we've been able to do with V6, and really something you can do whenever you do a major version change, is you can drop support for things. You can change interfaces. So we've dropped support for Internet Explorer 11. We've done an incredible amount of research around what browsers do we want to support and what JavaScript features are available in those browsers. So the very cool thing we can now do is leverage async await, for example, and other modern JavaScript features, not only in our code, but in the integration docs that we teach you and that you use to add the PayPal components to your site. The last point I wanted to make is around script loading. In the V5 SDK, for those of you that have used it before, you have to add query string parameters to that SDK script. It's kind of weird. It's unusual, but there's a good reason for that. Those query string parameters, for example, there's a components key, and you pass in the value of the components you want, like buttons and card forms. It's actually like an API that's taking that input from query params and dynamically building JavaScript as the output and just returning the JavaScript that you need for your components. So it's a single JavaScript file. This was great and extremely fast back in 2017. But now with HTTP 2 and 3, the browsers actually work really well with multiple small JavaScript files. They can load them in parallel, and it's quite fast. So we've embraced that model. We've removed a lot of complexity around dynamic script building. So now we just have a static script that's called our core SDK that you'd add to your site. And that core SDK script can load the optional components that you want. Or you can even use individual script tags for PayPal payments and card forms and Venmo on your doing it yourself.
All right. Let's talk about how flexibility was a driver for merchant success when we were designing this SDK. First, let's take a look at V5 here. So we know that we need a flexible SDK. We need one in V5, we need one in V6. How we expose that flexibility is through these params at either the script level or in the buttons object. So you can see here, this is on the very right, this is a standard SDK URL that you would put in your script tag. That's a pretty long string. There's a lot of things in there, your client ID, enable funding, disable funding, and so forth. Then we also have the buttons object, where we put another layer of component level configuration. You got your funding source, expand card form, style, so forth. If this is your first time looking at this interface, it's pretty confusing. What is the difference between funding source, enable funding, disable funding? What do they do? What takes precedent? You really have to go to the developer docs to understand how all this flexibility is output into the experience that your buyer sees. We tried to eliminate a lot of this complexity in V6. So let's take a look at that. We really wanted to create a purposeful interface, one that didn't rely on so many different configuration parameters. So you see here in the top right, in V6, this is how you would create your instance. Now, we did bring over some attributes to configure your SDK with. You have your client token, which is a replacement for the client ID. You have page type, locale, and obviously components. But outside of that, there's not much more. You see this method down here in the bottom screenshot, create PayPal one-time payment session. It's a fairly lengthy method name, but it's really descriptive. You know exactly what's happening. This is a PayPal button, and it's a one-time payment checkout session. So now you have your callbacks. You do have one additional flag that you can pass in, but that's it. Now we don't have the need for all these query string params, and this is what the V6 URL looks like at the bottom right. Everything has been simplified, everything is purposeful, everything is easier to integrate with, as well as if somebody has integrated this and you're going back to review this code, it's much easier to understand. All right, let's talk about what we call presentation modes. So in V5, we did a lot of the magic based on the buyer, based on the device, based on the browser. We'll choose whether to show a pop-up or modal. In V6, we now give that fine-grained control over to you. Now, if you don't want that control, you still want the SDK to do all the magic for you, you can choose the auto flow, which Greg will walk through a little bit later, but that will choose the correct payment or the correct presentation mode. The fun thing about this in V6 is we also offer the payment handler. This is something that Google Pay and Apple Pay is built on, and it's a really, really crisp and clean native browser API that users love. And we're going to talk about how you can configure that a little bit later. Finally, we give flexibility and to support different integrations that include wrapping our SDK in an iframe. So we talked about how we don't have an iframe anymore, but now you can bring your own iframe. So if you work at a company with an InfoSec team that has very strict rules on third-party JavaScript, you can now isolate our SDK in an iframe and have it function properly on your merchant web page. So you can see here in the light blue, that would be the merchant's e-commerce site. And then the dark blue square, that would be a separate HTML file where the V6 SDK lives. And then you can communicate between the iframe and the parent page. Now, what we mean when we say that we support this integration is we have an overlay that when the user clicks on, the pop-up shows up and this overlay takes over the full screen. You can now turn off that overlay and display your own, and then handle the communication between the iframe and the parent page through post message. So you don't have to do this integration. This is only something that if you choose to do so. But the point here is in V6, we're trying to meet you at wherever your integration is and be flexible to whatever you want. Greg?
All right. So Andrew just talked about how flexibility is one of the main goals of the V6 SDK. We've gotten a lot of merchant feedback. They need to use the SDK in many different use cases, and we wanted to make sure we had flexible interfaces and building blocks. Another big goal of ours is performance. And I wanted to call out, the V6 team has been really blessed with the opportunity to start fresh with a greenfield project with rebuilding an incredibly successful product that's out there. The PayPal button's been around for 25 years. It's very proven and successful and critical to the company. And we've been given the opportunity to start fresh with a new SDK to ship this established product. Has anybody worked on a greenfield project like this before? Raise your hand. All right. Most of the people that raise their hand are on the V6 team. So performance is a goal of ours. Let me ask you another question. Has anybody bought a new car? Have you ever bought a new car before? Raise your hand. What are some of the things you did with that new car? You washed it, you waxed it, you kept it really clean, you changed the oil. You're very proud of that new car. 8 years later, what do you think of that car? Is it still new? No. Every car ends up in the junkyard eventually. And so does every SDK. So. As we jump into performance, our PayPal buttons and other components, they're running alongside merchant content on their e-commerce pages. That merchant content comes in fast. We want our payment buttons to come in fast too. And it's been proven with many, many studies, the faster your e-commerce website is, the better it converts. So let's take a look at a video here. I want you to pay attention to when things come in on the page. We're looking at a shopping cart page on an e-commerce website. Notice how I see the item, I see the amount, the blue checkout button, which is the merchant's, and then I see the PayPal checkout button and Pay Later button. There's a noticeable delay with this V5 integration. And if you're browsing the internet on your phone, not on Wi-Fi, like a slow 4G network, there's going to be even more of a noticeable delay. So we wanted to solve that problem. And we got to start fresh with the V6 SDK. One of the things we were able to do was build upon public APIs and decouple this eligibility data that was embedded in the V5 SDK and now have a public API that's responsible for returning that eligibility data. What this means for you as merchants is if you care about performance and want to optimize for it, you can call the eligibility API server side in your code. And then when you render your checkout page or your cart page, you immediately know what buttons to show. There's no blocking network calls at all. And for convenience, if you want the SDK to make this API call for you, we can do that too. So up next here, I have a speed test comparison between the V5 SDK and the V6 SDK. What we're going to look at is a simulated slow network, like 4G, for example, on your phone. You're not on Wi-Fi. It's slow. Things are taking a while. And we're going to be looking at a cart page. And on the left here is the V6 SDK, and on the right here is the V5. And pay attention to the clocks that are running at the bottom. All right. So as you may have seen with that, the V6 SDK loaded about twice as fast. So. So let me focus on two things with how we were able to accomplish this performance. Number one is with decoupling that eligibility data from being embedded in the SDK and having a public API that's responsible for returning it. So you can call that server side and no longer have a blocking call or the need for complexity with query string params and edge cache for managing that with V5. Instead, you can do it server side in V6 to get that information. And also, because we've eliminated query string params, the V6 SDK scripts, they're just static files. There's nothing fancy about them. They're static files that cache really well at the edge, so they're shareable among merchants and buyers. The second point that I want to talk about is the no iframes. So in V5, back in 2017, we had a very fast implementation of iframes. Has anyone tried to make iframes fast? It's really hard. So a lot of complexity came around with making the V5 components fast with iframes. I actually joke a lot with people that the PayPal button in V5 is the most complicated button in the world. If you think you know a more complicated button, come talk to me afterwards. So what we do to make iframes fast is we have a two-phase render cycle in V5. The first phase is we'll render in an iframe tag without a source attribute. We call that pre-render, and it's a client-side render of the buttons. The tricky thing with that, though, is we don't know much information yet at that point. So, for example, the Venmo button's not functional. It's just a button drawn on the screen, but you can't click on it. Which is problematic, because if somebody's on a slow network and sees the button, they try to click on it, it doesn't work, they're going to choose something else to check out with. Then we have second render, which is an HTTP GET endpoint with lots of query params that returns HTML, and it returns a server-rendered version of these buttons. And then once that's done loading, it swaps out the source tag on the iframe to show those server-rendered buttons. You know, as a buyer or customer, you don't notice any difference that these buttons were swapped out from first render to second render. You know, after that, then the JavaScript that's embedded in that iframe needs to evaluate, and then finally the buttons are interactable. It is a very impressive solution to make iframes fast. But thankfully, we don't need iframes anymore for buttons in V6. So we got to go back to the drawing board, be simple with web components, and eliminate all of that complexity. There's just a single render cycle now in V5, or I'm sorry, in V6 with the web components, and they're built to be reactive too. If any data changes and they need to update, for example, the color or the button label, they can do that without having to be destroyed and reloaded.
So often when we talk about PayPal, Venmo, we're thinking about a checkout experience or a cart experience, but all of the performance benefits and modifications that we've done in V6 make it a really great SDK for upstream presentment. So this P2P page is highly optimized for SEO and performance. Well, now we have an SDK that fits in right to that architecture. You saw earlier the demo where the cart page came in and then later on the buttons came in. with a server-side eligibility call that the response can be cached, you can then render this PayPal button lightning fast, just as the rest of the other elements are coming in on this page. And the way that we've done that is through no iframes. We know this now. We have no iframes. I think we've drilled that in. And then we also have semantic HTML. So all these bots that are crawling the page, the Google bot or other search engine bot or agentic bot, can now easily read this page, and PayPal is natively integrated to this P2P page. And then finally, as we mentioned, client-side API calls can be moved to the server. So it's really exciting. This SDK can fit in so many different locations, as a flexible integration, as well as being flexible for different P2P cart and checkout experiences. Let's look at some code.
All right. So we've talked a lot about V6. Now we want to show you some integration code for V6 and how you can change different features to make it, to embrace that flexible design. I'm going to show you three main things in this video. Number one, how to style the button using just web component props and CSS. Number two, how to update these buttons after they're rendered based on some data changes, like, for example, the customer changing their language preference from English to Spanish. And then number three, I'm going to highlight the presentation modes that are available in V6 for advanced users. All right, so let's dig in. Here in this first example, we're changing the button label. It's just a prop on the web component, and you can see we switched it to Buy Now, and the button label has updated. For changing button color now, it's just a CSS class. I'm adding PayPal White as the class name, and notice how the button goes from gold to white. And third, for styling changes that are a range, like border radius, we have CSS variables available. Here, this demo is going from 4-pixel border radius to 20 pixels. All right, here in this locale example, I'm going to pause it for a minute. And I wanted to talk about this use case in V5 today. So if you're a merchant and you're setting locale explicitly, you do it in the query string parameter in the V5 JS SDK. Let's say you want to change that locale. You want to have a drop-down in your website like this that has many different languages, and your customer can change it, to their preferred language. In order to implement that in V5, you actually have to reload the SDK itself with the new query string parameter, and that destroys all the components on the page and re-renders them. In V6, we have an update locale method. So nothing needs to be reloaded or destroyed. We simply have to call update locale, and it will dynamically update these web component buttons. So as you can see in the dropdown here, the button label is changing languages, and it's quickly re-rendering just that label. All right, presentation modes. This is my favorite feature of the V6 SDK. You can see I highlighted the auto presentation mode. When I click on the PayPal button, I see the standard pop-up. This has been around forever, ever since the internet started. If we want more granular control, we can move from auto over to something like payment handler. And I'm going to pause the code here to be able to speak to it a bit more. So has anybody heard of payment handler or payment request? We've got a few hands. It's a new browser specification built into the browser. Google Pay leverages it, Apple Pay, as Andrew mentioned, and PayPal leverages it now too. It's a better buyer experience. It's a more sandboxed pop-up that cannot be lost behind the browser. So to implement that, it's not part of the auto flow today because it's not available in every browser, but you can explicitly ask for it by setting your presentation mode to payment handler. And we've embraced error codes in the V6 SDK. Things go wrong. And as a merchant that's integrating our code, we want you to be able to leverage error codes to know what went wrong and then make another decision on what to do. So for example, you don't have to feature detect payment handler yourself to see if the browser supports it. We'll do that for you. And if Start throws an error here with payment handler, the catch block will have an error with the code that you can check and see, payment handler is unavailable. Let me show a fallback presentation mode. And in this example, we're falling back to the trusted pop-up. All right, so let's take a look at the UI of payment handler. Now when I click on the PayPal button in Chrome, notice this new pop-up screen. This is payment handler. It cannot get lost behind the browser. You may have noticed if you're somebody that has many, many tabs or doing a lot on your computer and you open a pop-up, you click around, you click back, and now your pop-up's missing. And you have to somehow find it to complete your purchase. With payment handler, that's sticky, that's stuck on top. It's a clean interface, and on mobile devices like on Android Chrome, it has a really slick interface that pops up from the bottom that really emulates a native app. All right, so Chrome, let me go back to that part of the video. I want to show you the fallback experience in Safari here. So here in Chrome, we see payment handler. It's working great. Safari has fully implemented payment handler, but they do not want to share it. It's only for Apple Pay. So we are stuck here in Safari, falling back to the standard pop-up. All right, so let's recap what we talked about. The V6 SDK is built for the modern web. We embrace web components, we embrace async await, and several other modern features in JavaScript that are available to all the modern browsers. And we also have implemented graceful fallbacks when features aren't available, like the dialog feature of JavaScript. So we've thought a lot about our modern web strategy here to make sure we're not negatively impacting any buyers on the internet still. The other thing we've had as a goal is a flexible design with interfaces and building blocks. We talked about embracing explicit function names with our interface. So a one-time payment session, a reoccurring payment session, a vault without purchase payment session. These are explicit names now versus in V5, everything window.paypal.buttons that can do many, many different payment flows. So we've got explicit interfaces. We've also got flexible building blocks, as we talked about, with presentation modes, with the decoupled payment eligibility API. We know merchants have many different use cases, and we wanted these building blocks available so they can go ahead and piece them together based on their needs. And finally, by embracing a simple design, embracing the modern web, we've been able to make V6 fast. And the performance video that I showed earlier is a great demonstration of that speed. All right, we talked about V6 a lot. Now it's your turn. Go ahead and scan this QR code. You can get to our V6 public GitHub repo with all of our integration samples. There you can go ahead and run all the code that I just demoed previously. You can see payment handler in action, one-time payments, vault without purchase are in this repo. And as we add more features to the V6 SDK, we'll be putting them in this repo as well. All right, that concludes our presentation. Thank you, everybody. We do have time for Q&A.
Yeah, any questions?
Yeah, what questions do you have?
Or excitement?
What's for lunch? All right. Let's do these two over here first. You in the back.
Yeah. What components are already available? So buttons, messages, card fields?
Yes. Great question. So the question was, what components are available in the V6 SDK? We have the PayPal button, the Venmo button, as you've seen. We have the credit messaging and card forms coming soon. They're not out yet, but they should be out in the next couple months. And we're working fast to have full feature parity with the V5 SDK. I think the other things that are coming up pretty fast too in the next couple months are Apple Pay and Google Pay alternate payment methods via PayPal.
Yes, absolutely. We have a very rich roadmap. 2025 is going to be a lot of work for us.
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Can they live side by side?
Great question. Can the V5 SDK and V6 SDK live side by side on a merchant page? The answer is yes. So we worked really hard for window.paypal to support both SDKs on the same page. We're leveraging a global property on the window object and sharing that among the two SDKs. The nice thing with V6 is we do very little on the global window object at all. We leverage it for our first function, which is window.paypal.createInstance, and the version, but that's about it. And if you do add them side by side, we actually move the V6 SDK under window.paypal.v6. So that way you can differentiate between what's V5 doing here and what's V6
So
doing.
you could get started today and actually control the gap between those buttons that drives you crazy?
Yes, yes,
Yes, you can.
You can do your PayPal and your Venmo and leave all your Apple Pay and Google Pay and everything else on the V5.
That is correct. I'm feeling excitement.
The struggle is real. Stop.
All right, we've got another question in the back.
Yeah, so our app uses the React PayPal package. Is that going to be using the V6?
That is definitely on. So the question was, is the React PayPal JS library going to be using the V6 SDK? That is definitely on our roadmap. I would say it's a focus of this year. Right now, the answer is no. But as we get more and more parity with the V5 feature set, we'll be looking to swap out those SDKs and do a major version bump of our React library. But it's something that a few folks on the team are really passionate about.
Yeah, the React PayPal JS library is awesome. It's really convenient. We do have a React example if you're curious of what does it look like to integrate V6 with React, because we're just using web components. It's pretty basic actually. So if you scan this QR code under the one-time payments folder in the client directory, there is a React example you can take a look at. Yes?
Can you talk a little more about that, the public API call to do the eligibility? Like, how does that actually work? How is it public and still like secure at the same time?
Yes. So great question. Tell me more about this new payments eligibility API. How is it secure? How is it public? So you can, as a merchant, you can consume this API just like you would with the orders API. You take your full scope access token and you can call it to identify yourself. And it will return back what payment methods you as a merchant are eligible for. It can take other inputs around the buyer's environment, like where is the buyer located around the world based on their IP address or their user agent string, and incorporate that in the eligibility checks too. I think your question about how is it secure, server-to-server communication secure with the full scope access token. For client-to-server communication, this new client token that we require as input with the V6 SDK, it's a short-lived token. You generate it server-side, you give it to your browser on the client. It's safe for the browser. It identifies you as the merchant. If you're a partner, it identifies you as the partner and the merchant operating it on that page. And that is used to authenticate with the client-to-server call with the payments eligibility API. All right, any other questions? All right. Oh, one more.
Do you know if the Braintree folks are working on the native payment handler integration, or do they support that? It's not really.
No, that's a great question. So for merchants that have onboarded on Braintree and use the Braintree Web SDK, is Payment Handler available? For the PayPal button, not yet, but we are looking into officially supporting Braintree merchants with this V6 SDK. And that way you could use payment handler. Yeah.
Is that something that's interesting to you?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yes, and we learned a lot from Braintree's Web SDK architecture with their flexible interface, explicit function names, and we've followed a lot of that pattern in the V6 SDK. And the client token pattern from Braintree as well is something that is interoperable with the V6 SDK. So you can bring your Braintree client token and use that with the V6 SDK. Yes. All right. Yes.
Greg, what paths do we offer our merchants? Like if I was a merchant on V5 and I wanted to move over to V6, do we have documentation guiding me through that process?
Yes. Great question, Sunny. So I want to get to V6. How do I upgrade? Are there docs available? We have a limited release guide that's available right now, and we have this example repo. So those are your two resources available to you. As we work towards feature parity, our docs will move from limited release over to being generally available. And when we continue adding to our docs, which will be happening a lot over the next couple months, we'll focus on specific upgrade patterns. Like, I got this V5 code, how do I get it to V6? The nice thing too is, your create order callback where you've had to put up a public endpoint to support order creation and capturing or authorizing orders with onApproved, those conventions are the same. So those will migrate over really easily. And that's probably the most complex part of getting V5 to work, is getting those callbacks correct. So the nice thing is you can reuse that with the V6 SDK.
We have put a lot of effort into our examples repo where it has the full end-to-end integration. But if there's anybody here that would like a link to our limited release guide, please come find me. I will make sure to get you that link. But the best resource right now is definitely our examples repo.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Go eat some food.